Welcome everyone to this episode of DLNM's Mitote, Multilingual Instructional Talks on Transforming Education. The purpose of this podcast is to capture and share essential information and promising practice and resources with dual language leadership in our communities. This episode is entitled The Thomas Collier Graph, and we'll have a discussion today on today's Dual Language Education Research Foundation, what it is, and what we still need in order to strengthen it. Our guests today were core to the dual language education movement of the 90s and the 2000s. Their research silenced many of the critics and informed our leaders as to how to design and implement effective dual language education. They are giants in our dual language community and friends to so many of us who are yet in the trenches doing the good work. In 1995, there was around 250 dual language education programs, and with gas in the tank, that is research done by these two wonderful people, today there are over 4,000 dual language education programs across the U.S. It is my pleasure to introduce Drs. Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas to this episode of Mitote. Welcome, guys.
And our pleasure to be here, too.
Gracias, David. We're so glad to be here.
That's wonderful. I know many folks still read everything you guys put out there that you publish. What are you up to these days? How are things going for you?
We're working hard. We're supposed to be retired, but that isn't working.
Anytime we talk about retirement, it has quotes around it, like so-called retirement. Yeah, right.
Got it.
We're writing more editions of the books, the 5 books that we published with Dual Language Ed of New Mexico. You're going to see more in the future.
New, improved.
Yeah, dramatically improved. And we'll be working on, we are always available to do speaking, but by Zoom, we're no longer traveling. And we still do professional development and all those kinds of good things for folks. We do a lot of answering people's email when they ask questions about dual language. So we keep very, very busy. We also farm organically.
Yeah, still. A couple of the interesting things that I have been really intrigued by recently is we have had some opportunities in the last several years to work with school districts as they are trying to improve their dual language programs and as they are moving towards evaluating them and really evaluating them, not just kind of giving it a once over lightly, but doing a thorough job. So we have had the great pleasure of working with several school districts in doing that. We advise school districts, especially on this side of the country, by Zoom on the issues that come up as they are starting new programs. We have one particular one here in our own state that we are following very closely because they're getting fired up to start a whole new dual language program, and they don't want to have to recreate the wheel from the very beginning. They want to hit the ground completely developed and be ready to go, and we're trying to help them accomplish that. So we have very interesting things to do now that we are spending a lot less time analyzing data. We're spending more of our time actually working with school districts in an advisory capacity by Zoom.
Yes, virtually, and that is a good thing about Zoom. You mentioned program evaluation, Wayne, and I know we've had lots of conversations about this. This is, the research that you've done, so important to schools, really lends itself very well to being able to do effective program evaluation. So let me get you started off with a question here. Is we know that the original bilingual education programs in the late 60s, early 70s were in fact dual language education models, but through the 70s and the 80s, we saw a watering down of those models. I would say in general, there was a number of different challenges that were facing the field. And we saw dual language education approach turn to more of a transitional bilingual education approach in those decades. But in the 90s, there was sort of a recommitment by a number of communities to the idea of dual language education for all. And it was your research that really fueled the tank to get that dual language education movement going again. Tell us about the research, a little bit of the background, why it was done, how it was done, and then why is it still relevant today when we consider the research foundation for our strong dual language education programs out there.
Okay. A real quick overview of the three major things that we started out analyzing. We started out with the how long question. How long does it take to get to grade level in your second language? And then that expanded into the PRISM model as we figured out what are some of the things that seem to influence the process of second language acquisition.
What factors really drive that process?
Yeah, because it seemed like it took a long time, and we said, why? Why did it take such a long time? And then that led to the graph, that was over almost a decade and a half a decade of research together, where we came into understanding fully that it's the type of program that students receive that makes the difference in the bottom line of all the different issues that influence second language acquisition.
We should remind people that although you are a linguist and an educator of English learners and that sort of thing, ESL, bilingual instruction, I'm a specialist in program evaluation and research methodology. I was both my master's and my PhD are in those subjects. I was a school administrator, I was a high school teacher, but until I met her, and we're talking early 80s here, I was pretty much convinced that English only was the way to go. Well, that didn't stay that way, because we looked at data together. She was saying all these things in mid-80s, like bilingual programs are greatly superior. And I'm saying,
I was a bilingual educator.
Yeah.
And so when we met, and I tried to convince him of this, he said, well, I don't believe what you're saying, but I can be convinced by data.
And boy, was I convinced by data. The first study we did, oh my goodness.
And we've now done 37 school districts in 16 US states,
Right.
and one whole state.
Right. Now,
over 8 million student records.
Total of only 8 million student records are run through our computers, yes. Now, for context, the 80s and well into the 90s was the heyday, and notice I used the past tense, the heyday of the English-only movement. They were really coming out everywhere. And we really thought we were fighting a war, or at least a major confrontation.
It felt like it.
It really did. Yeah, there were some really scurrilous, in my opinion, attacks on us and on other people in the field who were trying to promote the notion of that dual language and bilingual education in general, but dual language in particular, was greatly superior to the English-only solution to the problem, as they would put it, of English learners. And so we really did. I mean, I'm still bear some of the scars of that period, not physical scars, but boy, I'd like to, those kinds of scars. And so as we moved into the 90s, then things began to change. We had been analyzing data for several years, and we had done literature review. We had looked at a whole host of studies, and you published that later towards the end of the 80s. But we had already looked at a bunch of existing studies of programs that we were interested in. And we had analyzed data for at least 5 or 6 years from school districts all around the country who had asked us, would you please analyze our data? Would you please evaluate our program? And so we said, well, okay, yeah, we have time, and we will, and we did. So we had a notion of what was happening into the early 90s, and you've already indicated that in the early 90s, we had already looked at the how long question, and the real important thing that happened, at least from my perspective, from program evaluation, as we were asked to be a after-the-fact part of the Ramirez study, David Ramirez's study. That was absolutely huge, powerful for me, because he asked me in particular to evaluate that study. They had already finished it. They were presenting it. He said, we have AERA, American Educational Research Association papers coming up. Wayne, I want you to evaluate the report and say, give your professional evaluation point of view, give your opinion of it. I gave it a really thorough going over, and it was instrumental in convincing me One, that short-term studies would never give us what we need to know. All right. And up to that point, really, there were only short-term studies. There were very few. You can perhaps list a small handful number of longer-term studies. But what the Ramirez study did is that they had been tasked by the U.S. Department of Education to compare basically structured English immersion to various
or what he called early exit, and then later he added late exit because he saw that a lot of kids were still in transitional bilingual ed by 4th and 5th grade.
So David, as far as I know, David Ramirez actually invented the late exit term. He said early exit is not enough. 2 or 3 years is not getting us where we need these kids to get. We need more. And so he set up a situation where there was one 3-year group and another 3-year group, and they linked them together. And when I saw the results of that, I went, that's what's going on. It's every year there's a small effect. If you only look for 2 or 3 years, you don't see anything impressive. But if you look for 5 or 6 years, then you see very impressive stuff. So the Ramirez report, not to go on too long about it, was absolutely central for me.
I'm sorry.
And the key was that it's first language support for the students that makes the difference.
Right.
Doing that for a long period of time.
So that's what inspired me in particular, but inspired both of us to really go after this topic in the early 90s. Now, the federal government noticed our efforts and offered us some support in the early 90s, and we reported on that, and they were, this is very interesting. And they came back in 1996 and offered us to be nationwide a part of the Center for Research in Education, Diversity, and Excellence. We were Project 1.1, right out there in front of the whole National Research Center from 1995 to 2002. And so they basically bought us from George Mason University for that period of time and paid to send us all around the country, analyzing data, working with school districts, doing all this stuff. And that's where we really nailed down a lot of these concepts.
Because and that's when the graph came out.
And the graph came out as a result of that.
Let me go ahead and, for those who are just listening to this podcast, we're going to provide the link to the graph alongside the link for this episode of the podcast. But for those who are able to see the video version of this podcast, they can see that here on the screen. You guys want to talk a little bit about the graph? Explain it to us.
Sure. Go ahead. Want to take it?
I'll start.
All right.
So all the solid lines on the graph are English learners. We have been criticized for saying, two-way has English speakers in it, but we did not include them in this particular figure. So this is showing you how English learners do when they start school with no proficiency in English in kindergarten, and following them through. And we found that clearly it's the program that makes the difference. And dual language, either two-way or one-way, are the only two that are able to completely close the gap by the end of schooling.
One of the most important concepts to bear in mind here is that it doesn't show in this graph, but if you look at the bottom where it says grade, from grade 1 to grade 11, there is an invisible marker there which says cognitive demand of the curriculum and the tests. The first, second, third grade tests are relatively undemanding cognitively. All right. When you get to grades 4, 5, 6, things get much more difficult cognitively. And after grade 7 and 8, they're a lot more difficult cognitively. So you can see from the graph there in the first 4 grades, looking at the bottom of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4 there, basically there's no difference among the programs in the first 4 years or 3.5 years at least of elementary school. You can see why a short-term study is always going to give you the wrong answer. Even our research would indicate that there's no real substantial difference as long as the curriculum and the tests are not cognitively demanding. But once the demand gets ratcheted up, look at the difference among the program lines, the same children followed across time between grades 4 and 8. There are colossal differences. And the reasons are The students in the upper lines, the dual language lines, are cognitively developed by dual language to the point where they can cope with the increased cognitive demand of the tests and of the curriculum. And the students who don't get that cognitive acceleration and development in the other remaining programs no longer make any more gap closure. All the other programs flatten out after grade 4, and there's no more gap closure. They make 1 year's progress in 1 year's time, but so do the native English speakers. There's no more gap closure for all of the other programs after grade 4.
And this is only when tested in English. We expect these kids in the dual language programs and in the transitional bilingual ed programs to be on grade level in their first language, their primary language. So you're keeping them on grade level in their first language. The dotted line 50th percentile is describing what the native speakers of the language are doing. So in this case, since this is a test of of English, this is talking about how the native English speakers do. 50th percentile means grade level achievement. And so the dual language kids get to above grade level. The two-way kids get there by around 5th grade, maybe 6th grade. And the one-way kids get there by 8th grade. One-way means that they don't have native English speakers in the class. That's mostly students who are started as English learners.
And get there is defined as they score as well on difficult school tests across the curriculum as native English speakers do. Mm-hmm. We're not asking about how proficient are they. We're not asking anything about reclassification. That's a much lower standard. Yeah. This is all the way to full parity with native English speakers across the curriculum. How long does that take? And the answer is a lot longer than most people thought.
Typically, it takes 3 to 4 years to get to proficiency, English language proficiency on just a proficiency measure. And so then they're reclassified, and that's when we say, okay, that's it. You don't need to be in a program anymore. Not important. And that's not true because they're not yet at grade level. They're usually at about the 35th percentile, something like that. And it takes another several years, 3 to 4 years, for them to get to grade level in their second language. But it's the stimulus of the schooling in first language that makes the difference. One more thing about the graph. This is longitudinal data. This means that we're following the same kids from kindergarten all the way through the end of high school. And nobody that we know of had ever done that before we did created this picture based on the many data, the many studies that we had done by that time.
This data is from school districts we worked with all during the mid-'80s and up through the mid-'90s and into the 2000s later on. We have, and some of them very large school districts that were able to give us lots of data. So there's several 100,000 students in each in these graphs. This is not your typical study that has 200 kids in one group and 100 kids in another group. This is a long-term study that follows the same several 100,000 kids over a long period of time. And yes, a lot of them were dropped out. The dropout statistics for English learners, even now, if you're not in a dual language program, 50% of them drop out by the end of high school. But we followed the ones that were able to stay in school. And what we have here is the ones who survived, the ones who did not drop out. As you can see, the long term is not a pretty picture. All of the other programs, other than dual language, only close half or maybe a smidgen more than half of the total long-term achievement gap. And that's a very just depressing thing to acknowledge, but it's true.
And in our most recent publications, we've talked about the studies that are looking at graduates of dual language, where we're finding that they're graduating at much larger numbers. So like one school district was formerly graduating 50% of their English learners. Now they're graduating 95% of their English learners. One school district in Nebraska is graduating 100% of their English learners. So
there are huge differences in graduation rates.
Huge differences. These kids are going right on to college and successful in life.
So what the graph says to you is pick the program where you want your students to be by high school. Most school districts looked at this. In fact, I think it was Houston, the superintendent put this graph on his business card and says, this is what we want to do. Dallas, sorry, beg your pardon. And said, we want our students to be above that 50 percentile line. And there are only two program alternatives that get us there. One-way dual language and two-way dual language. So we want dual language. All the other opportunities, all the other program alternatives allow for students who are English learners to make progress, but in the end, they don't make enough progress to completely reach full parity with native English speakers across the board. That's the point.
This is wonderful. And I mean, your work really showed, because I'm sorry, to this day, there's very few school districts, states who have been successful in looking at their students over time and as far as how well they respond to whatever program model and instruction that they're receiving, ideally consistently, right? Kinder through graduation. Can you speak a little bit to—
I wanted to just point out that in the blue book and in the red book, this describes the how long figure really, really well, especially in the red book, pages 91 through 96.
Please read 91 to 96 in the red book, okay? And then we'll talk.
As you had mentioned earlier, through Dual Language Education of New Mexico, DLENM.org, you are able to get those books still, as they are your publisher and put the books out there. All right, guys, tell me, obviously the Department of Education was very interested early on, and kudos to them, because I don't always hear administrators in those offices actually paying attention to especially what's happening with our emerging bilinguals and what we're trying to do for our second language learners. Why should policymakers today be so interested in what the graph and your research says? What's of value for them? Can you speak a little bit to that?
All right. Well, we have always operated under the proviso that what policymakers should be doing is first find out what really works. Not what people think works, not what people think might work, but what actually demonstrably works. Getting good answers to that question, and then you put your resources and your time and your staff and your energy into what works. That's our guiding principle. It always has been, especially mine. So with that in mind, we have always tried to put our research out there in a form that is what program evaluators like me would call decision facilitative. We are trying to present information to decision makers, to policymakers. This is what you need to know to make a good, sound, intelligent, and worthwhile decision about what's the best program for your students. That's our goal, our philosophy, what we aspire to. And in doing that, we make sure that our data or that our research is first well-based theoretically, and that's why we will develop the PRISM model. It's a theory and a guide to and it should be a basis for your logic model approach that we can talk about later as well. So first, our research is not just out there, it's theoretically well-based. Secondly, we have always followed good rules from research design, from advanced statistics, from those kinds of areas to make sure that what we do is something a decision maker can rely on. And that takes on a variety of different aspects here under the bottom half of this particular slide. One of the more important ones is that we've always tried to increase statistical conclusion validity. Most people don't even know what that is. And if you're a researcher and don't know what that is, you need to find out. What it means basically is that most people's sample sizes are too small to find the difference they want to find. Even if it's there in the data, you can't find it because you don't have enough data cases to statistically be able to find a real difference that's there. Okay, that's a really common thing in education. And so what does that mean? Most education studies find no significant difference. including all during the 80s, everyone doing, which is better, English only or transitional bilingual ed? The answer was no significant difference because they were all small, short-term studies. If you go to the long term and enlarge your sample sizes greatly to giving them more power, you find that there is a difference. Even transitional bilingual ed is slightly better than English only. And the larger your sample, the better statistical conclusion validity you have, the more you will see that. This is really commonly ignored right up to the present day. Too many studies have samples that are too small. Ours have always had hundreds of thousands of cases, and so we have never really had a real issue with statistical conclusion validity. Secondly, we've tried to balance three things that are important. The federal government and a lot of people know about internal validity. That's making sure you have alternative explanations for your results that you've taken care of. You've accounted for those. And so things like random assignment or other such or matching, things like that are used to control for alternative explanations. Those are called internal validity issues. But there's also external validity. If you have a random assignment study, it's really powerful for internal validity, but you've created a situation which is nothing like the real world, and therefore you've damaged your external validity. The federal government and many other people ignore that issue, and everybody ignores statistical conclusion validity. So what we try to do is to balance all three, to do the best job we can with internal validity, to greatly expand our external validity. How? By doing research all over the country, not just in Central Virginia where we are, but also in New Mexico and California and Texas and New York and Illinois and all over the place. And if the findings are the same in all those locations, that gives us much better reason to believe in the generalizability or external validity of our results. Okay, so we try to do all three. The vast majority of researchers emphasize just internal validity. That's, we think, a problem. We always do measures of practical significance. The statistical significance test is very weak. You can manipulate statistical significance by making your sample size smaller or larger. It's almost completely a matter of sample size. If something is statistically significant at the 0.01 level, has mostly, almost completely to do with sample size. But if you can compute measures of effect size, that tells you not only is this a larger than zero difference, that's what statistical significance tells you, it also says this is a powerful difference. This is a get off your chair and do something difference, okay? This is that kind of difference, practical significance, and there are measures of that which we always compute, and not everybody does. We wish they did, but they don't. I'm going to keep going here. Degree of gap closure. For years, and even now to some, people looked at what's the difference between the pre-scores and the post-scores. And someone would point out, well, there's no difference between the pre-test and post-test scores between transitional bilingual ed and ESL, therefore we'll just do the cheapest thing. Well, neither one of those two alternatives do more than close half the achievement gap. Okay? It doesn't matter which one is slightly different than the other when neither one of them is adequate for gap closure purposes. So we have always emphasized gap closure, something that a lot of people do now, but they didn't back in the early 80s. The analysis of multiple cohorts of data, that's something that is clearly from more the field of statistics. We have found several critics. One particular critic from political science didn't seem to know anything at all about multiple cohort analysis. Statisticians always do this to increase the robustness of their conclusions. If you find the same thing in 10 different sets of data, all from the same, from different time periods, that's a much stronger conclusion than just finding it with one group at one time. Okay, but it's something that I brought into this field from statistics, from the field of statistics, not from education or from ed psych. Disaggregation. I have been Dr. Disaggregation, and so has she for years. Okay, we look down at how are the special needs students doing in dual language programs in the state of North Carolina. There aren't that many of them. There are a few hundred of them. But how are they doing? Nobody else has been able to look at that because they weren't analyzing 8 or 5 million student records and therefore couldn't even find 100 kids in that. So we look very large data sets, and we are able to drill down and disaggregate a lot of groups that are of very much critical interest to policymakers. All of this is stuff that policymakers love. This is what they want to know to make better decisions. As my old superintendent used to say, if I just needed to make a decision, I can pull one out of my hip pocket. But you, Wayne, I want you to give me a good reason to do the right thing. That's what he used to tell me. And so that's what I used to try to do.
I'll give you one quick example of the disaggregation in our North Carolina analyses, which we finished a couple of years ago. When we presented the data to the state board, they just started jumping up and down with excitement because we had found that African American students of low income across the state of North Carolina are doing great in dual language. By middle school, they're 2 grades ahead of their peers, not in dual language. And they said, we've never found that in any other program we've done.
Not many people in your field are interested in that group. I am vitally interested in that group. I came from Title I. I specialized in analyzing data from kids from low socioeconomic status. So me in particular, have always been interested in at-risk students in general, not just the ones who are English learners.
Oh, there's lots more.
Yeah.
Too much to cover here.
We've utilized data mining. That means I, in particular, went back, dug out data from DC and all the other school districts we've worked with, dragged that data forward to the modern time, made it unanalyzable and viewable, and analyzed it. It's data from the past, but we're able to add that old data to new data and thus stretch out and lengthen our time period over which we could look at programs. That's how we got such long-term studies. We looked at data from the past as well as data from the present and from the future. We have improved the statistical and research design techniques to control for extraneous variables. We use fairly advanced techniques involving statistical adjustments after the fact. It's basically an extreme improvement on analysis of covariance. Those of you who maybe know about that, you take ANCOVA adjustments and you make adjustments after the fact so that you are getting a purer, better, more decision-oriented look at differences between groups that may otherwise be obscured by things like differences between one location or another, one type of program or another. You can adjust for differences statistically as well as operationally using things like grouping and sampling and random assignment. So we do that.
And I'll talk about the last
Please
one here, the program implementation. What we have done is after we began to catch on to the variables within a program that we needed to look at, then we started, when we contacted school districts, we tried to help them figure out whether their program met our criteria for analyzing their data. And then after a number of years, so many school districts were climbing up our backs. Please analyze our data so that we could choose school districts that had really strong programs to analyze their data. So that we teased out programs not well done as that we didn't analyze or we didn't present that data in our pictures.
Even to the present day, most researchers in this field compare programs as they find them.
Yeah.
In other words, they would go to District A and look at a dual language program in one school and compare it to a ESL content program in another school within the district or even across districts, with no thought whatsoever to how well each one of those two programs has actually been installed into schools and is implemented. And so what they wind up frequently doing is comparing a well-implemented ESL content program to a poorly implemented dual language program. What does that do? It makes the advantages and the clear superiority of dual language look smaller because the dual language program they're looking at was badly installed and implemented. So what you have here, what researchers would call a confusion of level of program implementation is being confused with level of program success and effect. What you want is a pure measure of program success where the levels of implementation are the same, or at least equivalent. Apples to apples. Why would you want to compare apples to quinces? Apples to apples is what you want. Well-implemented dual language compared to well-implemented ESL, well-implemented transitional bilingual ed, well-implemented anything. And so our research has always first, before the first data set is analyzed, looked at the school district and how well they are running their program. And we have worked with several for several years to help them improve their program, improve the quality of the implementation, and then we evaluate it. It makes no sense to evaluate a poorly implemented program. None of us needs to know how a badly run, badly installed program works.
Well said. And to this day, of the school districts that education works with, we still don't see enough school districts or states who are actually looking at their data properly, and that is longitudinally, right? In order for us to understand the program model that works and the instructional approach that works, we've got to look at those kids over time who have been in the same programs all the way through.
But I say, even up to the present day, most researchers are not looking at the degree of program implementation and installation before they start analyzing data. They're mixing apples and oranges in terms of implementation. And so you get wrong answers that way.
That's correct.
You get one program looking better simply because it's installed better and run better.
For those of us, for those who are listening in on today's podcast and to this episode of Mitote, I just want to bring to their attention that all of the information that's being shared today, you can find on thomasandcollier.com. Very easy to find there, thomasandcollier.com, all lowercase. Get information there, as well as some of the information, including the books published by our guests today, can be found at dlenm.org. Okay, guys, we're gonna have one more question for you on this one of this webinar, and there will be a part two. In order for us to close, or in order for us to share a little bit more for this part one of the webinar, you use the term well-implemented programs. Those are the ones you're looking for. Those are the ones you want to deeply analyze. What does it take from your experience and all the schools that you've done? Just in general, tell us what does it take to ensure a well-implemented dual language education program?
Well,
Over to you, Dr. Collier. I have some things to say too, but go ahead.
First of all, the first choice that's made by a school district is which partner language you're going to develop the program in. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing else that works as well as dual language. So from the very beginning, just think, okay, we're going to do a dual language program. And then what is that going to look like? So the partner language would typically be the language group that their largest number of students in your school district, that is the language that they grew up with, that they have. It might be their primary language. It's a strong language for them in their heritage. Since 75% of the students in the United States who are of other language backgrounds are Spanish speakers, it makes sense that a lot of the programs in the United States are Spanish English programs. Spanish is a very popular language with native English speakers, and so that increases the possibility that native English speaking parents will want their children to be in the program too. And that's the ideal when you get a two-way program where the two groups are working together.
That's the most powerful version.
And then if you're going to do a two-way, a next step that you have to take is how much time is going to be in the partner language and how much time in English. And it seems very non-logical. So a lot of people say, what? When you say, start out with the majority of the time in the non-English language. But that's what actually works better. And we have quite a bit of data to show that that works better. So a 90-10 or an 80-20 model where you give the kids a jump start in the language that's not supported by the broader society. And then after a couple of years of more instruction in that language, you increase the amount of time in English. And that works really, really well for both groups, for the English speakers and the English learners. Now those are just the beginning stages of implementation, and there's so much more. Includes the kind of teaching that's done. Dual language teaching is very powerful, but teachers have to be well trained.
It's not the same type of teaching as in transitional bilingual ed, is it?
It's a lot of cooperative learning, a lot of discovery learning. The kids are talking together, working together all the time because language acquisition is constantly going on. And there's just lots of stuff to acquire about style of teaching. But that really works for everybody. It really works for all the kids who join these classes. And you have to think about all kinds of administrative issues and make sure that the kids are not being pulled out for this and that. They don't need to be pulled out.
Not an effective strategy.
Dual language means that the teachers know how to do it, and they should stay in that classroom all the time, teaching each other through the two languages of the curriculum.
So if I were going to try to improve my dual language program, I would want to consult one of DLNM's best publications, not including ours, of course, the guiding principles, right?
Yeah.
I would want to look at that and say,
and get training from dual language staff.
Yes, and get training from people who actually understand dual language and how it's supposed to work. A lot of school districts decide, usually because of 2 or 3 board members, Wayne and Ginger have said for years, this is the best thing to do. Why don't we give it a try? And they don't necessarily go very far in training and providing the teachers with the additional, some of them will need additional training to be able to successfully deliver a dual language program. After all, most people don't realize that dual language programs are enrichment programs. They're not remedial. Many teachers out there know how to teach in a transitional bilingual ed classroom, but they may not know how to fully teach and best teach in a dual language classroom. It's an additional, more thoroughly developed set of teaching skills. And so, as my old mentor in evaluation, Mal Provost, used to say, you don't evaluate a program by how it is planned, you evaluate it by what's actually delivered in the classroom. And for that, starting with something like the guiding principles, these are the things that a good dual language program should be doing, and then applying a technique like logic modeling, where you work with somebody who generally knows how to do this, and basically make a roadmap of how your program is supposed to work according to dual language principles, according to what will best ensure its success. It's a deliberate plan. It's not something that happens to you like warts, okay? It's something you plan. You deliberately plot and plan a superior program that will give you the results that dual language well implemented is capable of.
And it is complex, but it's worth it.
Yes, it's so worth it. So we see so many school districts that just kind of, back into dual language because Wayne and Ginger thought it was a good idea, or because David thought it was a good idea. And they don't do much more than that. They use the same teachers, the same everything. And that doesn't tend to work well. Now, here's one more point, and then I'll let you talk. All right. We have found that dual language programs vary from about the 38th national percentile, the NCE, to about the 75th. That's a huge amount of difference. And how and why do they vary that much? How they were implemented. That's why.
Well, I want to thank you very much. We're going to save the further conversation on well-implemented programs for part 2 of this webinar. And I think it's Wayne, when you say something like, you can't just back into the model, you all go out, very charismatic, very influential with your research in tow, and you've impressed upon a lot of school districts that they should go dual language education. The ones that have been successful are the ones that take a step back and do that planning. And we'll talk about that in part 2 of this webinar. Thank you very much. I am here. Our guest for This episode have been Doctors Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas. The episode's title is the Thomas Collier Graph, which you heard about today, and a discussion around today's Research Foundation for Dual Language Education. Thank you both for being here with us today. We are going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll get part 2 recorded for our listeners. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for DLNM's Mitote podcast and this episode of the Thomas and Collier Graph, today's Dual Language Research Foundation. Information on the research and work of Drs. Thomas and Collier and how to get hold of them for consultation, please go to thomasandcollier.com. To see a video version of today's podcast, please go to dlenm.org. And if you're interested in purchasing and acquiring any of the publications, they're done by Fuente Press and DLENM. Please go to dlenm.org. Thank you.